Gearhart Mountain, near Bly, Oregon, the 5th of May, 1945, 10:45 a.m. The morning was crisp and clear, the kind of day where the sky looked almost too blue, where the trees stood tall and proud like sentinels, and the only sounds were the crunch of boots on pine needles and the cheerful laughter of children echoing between the evergreens. Archie Mitchell adjusted the brim of his fedora and glanced over his shoulder. His wife, Elsie, was walking just behind him, cheeks flushed with warmth and joy. She was 6 months pregnant, her coat buttoned carefully over the small curve of her belly. 5 children from their church Sunday school trailed behind her: Edward Engen, Jay Gifford, Joan Patsky, and her siblings Dick and Sherman. They were all teenagers, giddy with the freedom of a spring picnic in the mountains. Archie smiled. This outing had been Elsie's idea, a retreat from the noise of the world, from the ration lines and radio static that brought news from a war thousands of miles away. Out here, there were no bombers overhead, no blackouts, no grief, just the Oregon wilderness, serene and untouched. They had driven up the winding road from Bly in Archie's Buick, stopping near a favorite spot on the slope of Gearhart Mountain. Archie, a young Baptist minister, had planned to stay by the car to unpack the lunch and set up the meal. Elsie had insisted on walking the kids a bit farther up the trail to explore. That's when he heard her voice, puzzled, curious. "Look at that." Her words drifted back to him on the wind, light but clear. Archie paused, hands full of picnic baskets, and turned toward the ridge where the children had climbed. At first, he couldn't see what they had found. Then his eyes narrowed. Something pale was caught in the brush. A large, sagging shape, almost like a deflated hot air balloon. Long ropes trailed from it like tentacles. Metal hung beneath it. It looked utterly alien, as though it didn't belong among the rocks and pine. "Elsie," he called, a warning already forming in his chest. "Don't touch." But the sentence never finished. The explosion split the forest apart like the crack of God's own wrath. A thunderclap of sound and fire erupted from the ridge. Heat seared Archie's face. He was thrown to the ground, a deafening ring flooding his ears. Dirt, needles, and branches rained down like shrapnel. He gasped for breath, his heart pounding as smoke billowed through the trees. Then silence. A deadly, unnatural silence. Archie pushed himself to his knees. His hat was gone. One hand went instinctively to his cheek, warm, wet, blood. He staggered toward the ridge, shoes sliding in ash and dust. The shape that had hung in the trees was gone now, replaced by a blackened crater, smoking and raw. And on the ground still, broken, were the bodies. Elsie lay crumpled on her side, one arm shielding her stomach. The children had been caught mid-step, their young faces unrecognizable beneath soot and burns. No one moved. Archie fell to his knees beside his wife, his breath caught in his throat. He reached for her, but her skin was already growing cold. Tears blurred his vision. In that moment, the war had come home, uninvited and unforgiving. A balloon had killed them. He did not know it yet, but what he had witnessed was the only fatal enemy attack on the American mainland during World War II. A weapon so strange and silent it had crossed the Pacific Ocean, undetected, carried by wind and hope and vengeance. And it had found its target not in a city, not in a military base, but in a quiet Oregon forest, in the middle of a Sunday school picnic. Archie Mitchell would carry the weight of that day for the rest of his life. Tokyo, Japan, autumn, 1944. The room was dimly lit, quiet, except for the scratch of brushes across maps and the soft hum of radio chatter. Paper maps of the Pacific sprawled across the table like wounded animals, their blue oceans and red-ink trajectories forming the lifelines of a desperate empire. Major General Tsuyoshi Kusaba of the Imperial Japanese Army leaned forward, his eyes locked on a weather chart pinned to the far wall. Behind him, a team of engineers and meteorologists adjusted graphs and scrawled calculations with nervous precision. The war was turning. American bombers were striking the Japanese home islands with increasing intensity. Tokyo had burned. Saipan had fallen. B-29 seconds now launched from newly captured islands, and whispers of firebombing raids loomed. Morale was slipping. The empire needed a response, something that would remind the Americans that their homeland was not untouchable. But how? Japan had no aircraft carriers left to reach the U.S. West Coast. Submarines had limited capacity and range. Strategic bombing of America was impossible. That's when someone in the shadowy corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters floated the idea, a radical one born from the skies themselves. The jet stream. In the 1,920 seconds, Japanese meteorologist Wasaburo Aishi had discovered high-speed winds that circled the northern hemisphere at altitudes above 30,000 feet. These powerful air currents, moving eastward at over 200 miles per hour, flowed like invisible rivers across the Pacific. What if, Kusaba wondered, Japan could ride them? Ibaraki Prefecture winter. 1944. Inside a sprawling secret facility near the village of Ojiya, a strange army took shape. Not men, but balloons. Thousands of them. The project was codenamed Fugo, Windship Weapon. It would become one of the most bizarre and ambitious weapons of the Second World War. The concept was both elegant and terrifying. Launch hydrogen-filled balloons armed with incendiary bombs, time-fused explosives, and anti-personnel charges. Once released, they would ascend to 30,000 feet, enter the jet stream, and ride the wind across 6,000 miles of ocean. 3 days later, if successful, they would descend over the forests and towns of America and detonate, causing wildfires, terror, and ideally, panic. Japanese engineers toiled for months, perfecting the mechanism. Each balloon was crafted from handmade washi paper, strong, lightweight, and glued with konnyaku, a jelly derived from yams. Dozens of sheets were pasted together in hexagonal panels, forming a sphere nearly 33 feet in diameter. They were filled with hydrogen gas at specialized launch sites and tethered to a payload of up to 30 kilograms of bombs. A clever ballast system controlled altitude. Sandbags were dropped automatically when the balloon descended too low. When it climbed too high, a valve vented hydrogen. This allowed the balloons to hop along the jet stream for days, staying within the necessary altitude range. And when the final sandbag dropped, the bombs armed. The first of 9,300 Fugo balloons lifted off from Japan in November 1944 from coastal sites in Honshu. They rose silently into the cold upper atmosphere, fragile paper vessels of vengeance carried by wind, ambition, and imperial desperation. Soon, the West Coast began to notice strange things. In Montana, ranchers spotted parachutes tangled in trees. In Washington, a forest fire erupted under mysterious circumstances in early winter. In California, a balloon's remains were found near the coast. The FBI quietly investigated, collecting fragments, detonated devices, and eyewitness statements, but the truth was almost too strange to believe. The American public was kept deliberately in the dark. Fearing panic and, more crucially, not wanting to tip off Japan that the balloons were working, the U.S. military imposed strict censorship. Newspapers were told to ignore or bury reports. The Japanese, monitoring radio silence, began to assume their campaign had failed. They couldn't have been more wrong. By early 1945, over 300 Fugo balloons had reached American soil. They had landed in Oregon, California, Washington, Idaho, Montana, Wyoming, Utah, Arizona, Michigan, even parts of Alaska and Canada. Many caused only minor damage. A few sparked fires that were quickly contained. Others were never found at all, buried in the snow or tangled in remote forests. But they had made it. The Fugo campaign had succeeded in the unthinkable, touching the American mainland. It was the first and only successful intercontinental weapon strike in history, launched without pilots, without engines, without guidance. Just wind. Back in Japan. Spring 1945. Major General Kusaba received the final reports with measured optimism. No confirmed American casualties, no proof of success, but no evidence of failure either. Still, his country was burning. By March 1945, American B-29 seconds had incinerated large swaths of Tokyo in one night. Japanese civilians were dying by the tens of thousands. Fugo continued to launch, but production slowed. Hydrogen was scarce. Paper supplies dwindled. Manpower faded. And then, far across the ocean, in the mountains of southern Oregon, one of the last balloons found its victims, a minister's wife and 5 children, on a picnic. 6 innocent lives lost. The only confirmed enemy-inflicted deaths on American soil during World War II. The Foucault campaign would be erased from the news, buried beneath military silence until it was far too late. Off the Pacific coast, January 1945. The fishing vessel Yoshida Maru rocked gently in the early morning swell, its steel hull groaning against the gray waters of the Sea of Japan. On shore, the sun had not yet risen, but here on the ocean, a line of ghostly orbs floated upward into the pre-dawn sky. They were large, white, almost translucent, like paper moons ascending into storm-colored clouds. Each one bore the silent hum of tension. Aboard the launch barge, Japanese soldiers stood at attention, watching balloon after balloon disappear into the heavens. With each release, the crew bowed a solemn ritual. These weren't just weapons. They were prayers, prayers of revenge, of defiance, of desperation. These were Foucault, and they were already on their way, somewhere over the Pacific, 3 days later. The air at 30,000 feet is unforgiving, a thin, bitter cold that can kill a man in minutes. But for the Foucault balloons, it was the perfect highway. The jet stream, invisible to the naked eye, howled across the Pacific at over 200 miles per hour, pulling these fragile invaders eastward. The balloons bobbed and hissed as their ballast systems came to life. Altimeters measured pressure. Barometers triggered small explosions, dropping sandbags one by one. When they dipped too low, a fuse lit. A bag fell. They rose again. When they climbed too high, a valve hissed, venting hydrogen like a sigh. No men, no controls. Just paper, gas, and cunning engineering. It was quiet up there. No flak, no fighter interceptors, no radar to ping them. Just the stars above and America ahead. Portland, Oregon. The 10th of January, 1945. Far below, Americans began to notice. In a snowy field outside Portland, 2 boys on their way to school stumbled upon what they thought was a parachute tangled in telephone wires. It was huge, made of cream-colored material. Beneath it, wires trailed from an odd-looking metal box. They poked at it with a stick. It didn't explode. Instead, the entire contraption shuddered and collapsed, as though deflated by their presence. They ran home to tell their parents. Local police showed up and quickly contacted the Army. By noon, military engineers had arrived. The site was sealed. The debris was gathered up and taken away in covered trucks. No one spoke a word to the press. Boise National Forest. Idaho, February 1945. Forest Ranger Walter Brown hiked along a snow-packed ridge, the crunch of his boots muffled by a steady wind. He was scanning for signs of illegal campers or worse, fire. But what he found made him stop cold. In a clearing stood a circle of scorched earth. In the center lay a blackened metal cylinder, fractured open, surrounded by torn shreds of what looked like silk. He'd fought in France during the First World War. He knew what ordnance looked like. This had once been a bomb. Walter scribbled a note into his logbook and flagged the site. By the next day, a unit from the U.S. Army's 9th Service Command had arrived. They combed the area for fragments and whisked them away. Again, silence. Washington, D.C. February, March 1945. Inside the War Department's Office of Censorship, Colonel Ralph Ingersoll stared at the report in front of him, frowning. More than a dozen Foucault balloons had now been confirmed across 5 states. Some had been recovered intact. Others had detonated on impact, causing localized fires, one even near a power line in Washington. Another had come down on a farm in Montana, nearly injuring the landowner's son. And still, no one in the public knew. Military command, led by General George C. Marshall, had issued strict orders: no media coverage, no speculation, no panic. The reasoning was clear. If Japan believed the balloons were effective, they might intensify the campaign. But if they thought it was a failure, if they heard only silence, they might stop. So silence it was. Newspapers that had reported the first sightings were quickly advised to drop the stories. Editors complied. The FBI, coordinating with local law enforcement, ensured debris and witnesses were quietly handled. All reports were funneled to Army intelligence. Even the Japanese, who had prepared to listen for signs of success, were met with a vast, calculated American quiet. Rural Nevada, March 1935. Not all balloons made it intact. Some crashed in desert canyons, shredded by turbulence, or shot down by fighter pilots on patrol. Others never rose at all, their launch mechanisms failing, their hydrogen leaking. A few were spotted drifting harmlessly above remote highways. But the most dangerous ones, the ones with their bombs still armed, waited. In treetops, on frozen hills, in ranch fields, hidden, silent, deadly. April 1000, 945 amperes ticking threat. As spring arrived, so did a renewed wave of balloon sightings. With dry weather ahead, the Army grew nervous. Wildfires in the Pacific Northwest could overwhelm local resources. There were reports of strange wires hanging from trees, children collecting shiny fragments, even a cow being killed when a balloon exploded in a pasture. In one chilling case, a balloon bomb landed near the Hanford site in Washington, home of the Manhattan Project's plutonium production. It didn't detonate, but the proximity sent shockwaves through the highest levels of government. The campaign was no longer a curiosity. It was a threat. And still, no one said a word. Not to the press, not to the people, not to the pastor in Bly, Oregon, who was planning a Sunday picnic for his youth group. Bly, Oregon, May 1945. The town of Bly was the sort of place where news traveled by word of mouth and neighbors lingered in conversation long after Sunday service ended. Nestled in the remote highlands of southern Oregon, it was small, fewer than 500 residents, a settlement of lumbermen, preachers, schoolteachers, and farmers. Its roads were lined with pine dust. The nearby Gerhardt Mountain loomed quietly to the east, its slopes thick with fir and ponderosa. If you asked the townspeople, the war was something you heard about on the radio, something that happened in places with names like Iwo Jima and Bastogne, not anywhere near the banks of the Sprague River. There were stars in windows, sons off to fight in Europe or the Pacific, and there were ration books in every home. But there were also barn dances, quilting circles, and baseball games in the schoolyard. For most, the idea that Japan could ever strike American soil was beyond imagination. At the small parsonage on the edge of town, Archie Mitchell had recently taken over as the young minister of the Christian and Missionary Alliance Church. He and his wife Elsie had come to Bly in 1944 with quiet purpose and unshakable faith. Archie preached with conviction but never fire. He believed in God's plan and lived with a gentleness that put people at ease. Elsie, vibrant and kind, had taken to the town quickly. She taught Sunday school, played the piano during worship, and was beloved by the congregation. Children followed her like ducklings. With a baby due in a few months, there was anticipation in the air, a hopefulness that felt rare in wartime. Their world was modest but warm. Their faith was steady, and their lives, like Bly itself, seemed untouched by the flames engulfing the rest of the globe. On the morning of Saturday, May 5th, the sky over Bly was clear, the sun already high enough to warm the pine needles underfoot. Archie had planned a special treat for the Sunday school children, a picnic near Leonard Creek on the slope of Gerhardt Mountain. They would eat lunch, read from Scripture, and let the children run free. The war felt far away in moments like these. The only reminders were the occasional newspaper headline and the fluttering edge of a Victory Garden poster on the church bulletin board. Archie packed the car while Elsie rounded up the kids. There were 5 of them that morning, all from church families: Edward Engen, Jay Gifford, and the Patsky siblings, Joan, Dick, and Sherman. They were eager to escape the town, to play in the trees and breathe in the freedom of spring. Elsie smiled as she helped them into the back seat, one hand resting gently on her belly. Archie noticed, as he often did, how the sunlight seemed to catch the gold strands in her hair when she turned just so. The drive up the mountain was slow and winding. They passed logging roads, still muddy from the thaw, and groves of aspen just beginning to bloom. The road ended near a ridge with a panoramic view of the valley. Archie parked the car on a flat stretch near a clearing, and the group spilled out, laughing and stretching their legs. While Archie began unpacking sandwiches and a thermos of tea, Elsie led the children up the trail. They moved in a loose group, picking wildflowers and throwing pebbles into the brush. It was quiet, the only sound a red-tailed hawk overhead and the breeze moving through the pines. Then came a voice, one of the children. "Hey, what's that?" Elsie turned to see them pointing toward something ahead, half concealed behind a ridge of rock and low brush. At first glance, it looked like a giant jellyfish caught in the trees. A pale, sagging mass with frayed ropes and dangling wires. Something alien. Archie, still near the car, looked up when he heard them call out. He squinted toward the ridge and felt a tightening in his chest. The shape didn't look like anything he recognized. He took a step forward, raising his voice. "Wait, don't touch that." But it was too late. There was a sudden roar, a flash. The trees swayed violently, and a concussion of sound ripped through the clearing. The ground buckled. Smoke burst upward in a geyser of earth and fire. Archie was thrown backward, landing hard against a rock, ears ringing, dazed, his vision filled with smoke and dust and scattered branches. He scrambled to his feet, stumbling toward the ridge. The balloon, or whatever it had been, was gone. In its place, a wide black crater still smoking. Bits of twisted metal glinted in the dirt, and around the edges the bodies. They had been less than 10 feet from it. Elsie, the children, no one was moving. His breath caught. He dropped to his knees beside his wife, her body curled protectively over her stomach. Nothing. In a moment, the war had reached Bly, not in tanks or bombers, but in a silent enemy carried across the sky, a weapon no one saw coming. 6 lives lost, and no one yet knew why. The smoke lingered long after the blast. Acrid, heavy, it clung to the trees and drifted over the forest floor like a blanket of sorrow. Archie stood in the clearing, rooted in disbelief, his legs trembling. The scene before him refused to make sense: scorched earth, twisted shrapnel, bodies still and silent. Moments earlier, there had been laughter. Now, only echoes. He knelt beside each figure, touching shoulders, calling names, hoping for breath, for a cough, for anything. But the stillness answered him back. The wind stirred. The trees, once full of spring, now stood like mute sentinels to something ancient and cruel. He rose and stumbled down the slope toward the car. Every step was heavier than the last. At the roadside, he fumbled for the ignition with shaking hands and started the engine. The ride back into Bly was silent, but for the hum of tires on dirt. The shock had not fully landed yet. It hovered above him, waiting to descend. In town, the news spread slowly, at first passed in hushed voices along front porches, murmured across fence posts. By late afternoon, the sheriff had arrived at the site with 2 deputies and a medic. They returned pale-faced, whispering words like bomb, balloon, and explosion. A call was made to the regional FBI office in Portland. By evening, Army intelligence officers had been dispatched from Fort Lewis. The site was cordoned off. Debris was collected. Measurements were taken. Photographs snapped. Every piece of wire, every shard of scorched metal, every fragment of the balloon envelope was packed into military crates and hauled away. Residents were told little only that there had been an accident, and the area was to be avoided. But Bly already knew grief. The town gathered that night in the small wooden church. No one spoke at first. Then came the tears, the soft prayers, the arms wrapped around shoulders. A grief counselor from Klamath Falls arrived days later. He offered simple words and held the silence that followed. The pews were filled not just with sorrow, but with confusion. How? Why here? On Monday, black ribbons appeared on doorways. The flag at the post office was lowered to half-staff. The school closed its doors for the week. Children clung to their mothers. Fathers stood on porches, staring into the mountains, as though expecting something else to fall from the sky. The funerals were held 3 days later under gray skies. The coffins were small, too small, and the one at the front, larger, was wrapped in a blue cloth. The air inside the church was thick with the scent of pine and candle wax. Outside, the mountains stood quiet, still indifferent. By week's end, federal officials arrived in greater numbers. Military trucks rolled into Bly under the cover of darkness. The townspeople watched from their windows as soldiers carried out more equipment, more crates, more silence. There were no answers, only orders. All witnesses were instructed not to speak to the press. Reporters who arrived from Portland and San Francisco were met by polite refusals and redirected by Army officers. The local paper ran a one-paragraph obituary, omitting all reference to the explosion. The editor, when asked later, would say only that he was strongly advised to withhold details in the interest of national security. Hundreds of miles away, in the halls of Washington, D.C., generals and analysts pored over fragments recovered from the blast. They knew what it was. They had known for months. Fugo, the balloon bombs, the campaign no one had told the public about. Until now, no one had died. The military had hoped that silence would protect the nation, that ignorance, carefully maintained, would make the Japanese believe the campaign had failed. But now, 6 Americans were dead. The weight of that fact hung over the next meetings. Press officers debated whether to issue a public statement. The War Department feared panic, feared the political consequences of revealing that enemy weapons had reached the heartland and that civilians had died as a result. The FBI urged continued silence. The military agreed. The families of the victims were told it had been an incident under investigation. No word of Japan. No word of the weapon. Weeks passed. Spring crept forward. Snowmelt turned to river runoff. The forest slowly reclaimed, the blast site moss began to crawl over scorched bark, and wildflowers pushed through the cracked earth. But in Bly, nothing was the same. Children walked to school more quietly now. Church services were more somber. Windows stayed shuttered just a little longer at night. In the parsonage, Archie sat alone at his desk. The pages of his Bible lay open, but the words no longer anchored him. The pulpit stood silent. The nursery they had prepared remained untouched. Outside, the breeze rustled through pine boughs, the same wind that had carried death across the Pacific, unseen, unchallenged, unannounced. By early June 1945, the forest around Gerhardt Mountain had settled into uneasy quiet. Birds had returned to their nests. Green had begun to replace black. But within the offices of the War Department, the silence was wearing thin. The Army's internal reports circulated through increasingly nervous hands. More Fugo balloons had been recovered across the West, some scorched, some intact, others with timers still ticking. One had tangled in power lines near Toppenish, Washington, knocking out electricity to a critical radar installation. Another was discovered in British Columbia, its explosive payload still live, hidden beneath layers of snow that had preserved it like an artifact from another world. Military engineers were now instructed to sweep forests across the Northwest with Geiger counters and magnetic detectors. Specialized disposal units were deployed from Fort Ord, trained not only in demolition but in discretion. But the balloon that had fallen near Bly, the one that exploded and killed 6, lingered in the minds of command more than all others combined. This one had drawn blood, and with every passing day, more people were asking questions. In Portland, the regional FBI office continued to field reports from local police departments, forest rangers, even farmers. The descriptions were often vague: a parachute drifting across a field, strange white cords found in a creek, a hissing sound overhead in the early morning sky. Each report was logged, coded, and filed. The most sensitive were sent directly to Washington. But the agents knew they couldn't keep the story quiet forever. The Bly explosion had already rippled into nearby counties. School teachers spoke cautiously with each other. A minister in Klamath Falls asked his congregation to pray for a family broken by war at home. Truck drivers swapped rumors at gas stations, and a few local boys had even gone up into the mountains hoping to find another balloon. One did. He touched the wrong part. He survived, but only barely, his right arm shattered, his face scarred by shrapnel. The hospital filed a report. The Army retrieved what was left of the device within 12 hours. The boy's name never appeared in print. In newsrooms across the Pacific Northwest, editors were growing restless. Wire services had picked up whispers of something strange. A censorship order. connected to Japanese bombs. Some journalists were determined to break the story. They contacted sources, compiled sightings, tried to find families willing to talk. Most doors remained closed, but a few didn't. In one meeting, a correspondent from the San Francisco Chronicle sat across from an Army press liaison and laid out a stack of reports. "People know something's going on," he said. "You can't suppress gravity. These things are falling." The liaison didn't deny it. Instead, he made a single request. "Wait." The government was preparing a statement, he said. Soon. And then came the turning point, not in the woods, but in the skies above Japan. On April 1st, 1945, American forces had landed on Okinawa. It was the bloodiest battle of the Pacific, and the press was full of headlines about kamikaze attacks and dug-in resistance. But another story quietly began to take shape: the strategic bombing of Japan's cities. The United States was now firebombing Japanese industrial zones with horrifying precision. Tokyo, Kobe, Osaka. Entire districts flattened, burned to ash. Each wave of B-29 seconds carried thousands of pounds of incendiaries. And Japan noticed something else: the silence. For months, they had launched balloons into the Pacific, each one a fragile instrument of chaos, each one drifting toward a nation that never seemed to react. Tokyo's propaganda officers began to lose interest. Without confirmation of results, the army scaled back the program. Many in the high command assumed the balloons had simply failed, lost to the ocean, popped by turbulence, burned up in the upper atmosphere. They weren't entirely wrong. Of the 9,300 launched, fewer than 400 were ever recovered. But one had found its mark, and now Washington believed the danger had passed. On May 22, 1945, the United States government authorized a press release. It was brief, carefully worded, and designed to balance truth with control. "Japanese balloons have been observed in various locations throughout the western United States," it read. "They are considered a limited threat, and the public is urged not to tamper with any unfamiliar objects resembling meteorological equipment. Do not approach. Do not attempt to collect debris. Report sightings to the nearest military or police authorities." There was no mention of deaths. No reference to Bly. No details about the weapon's construction or purpose. But the censorship veil had lifted. The following week, newspapers from Los Angeles to Chicago began publishing stories under headlines like "Balloon Bombs Over Oregon" and "Japan's Strange Weapon Reaches U.S. Forests." Some carried maps. Others reprinted sections of the War Department's advisory. In Bly, the truth arrived folded inside the Oregonian, handed from neighbor to neighbor like contraband. So it had been real. The children hadn't stumbled onto old logging equipment or a dynamite cache. It had come from Japan. It had crossed an ocean, and it had killed them. Some felt relief. Others, betrayal. No official came to apologize. Far away, in a newspaper archive room in Tokyo, an assistant in the Ministry of Information clipped a column from a foreign report, one that had been translated and circulated among military leadership. American newspapers were now acknowledging the balloon bombs. The silence had broken. Japan's campaign had, after all, drawn blood. But by then, it was too late. The war was entering its final chapter, and other, far more powerful weapons were already taking shape. Continued to generate the next section. Tokyo, June 1945. The corridors of the Imperial General Headquarters had grown darker, heavier. The clean white walls of the war rooms were now covered in fresh maps marked in black ink, not American cities to be attacked, but Japanese cities already in ruins. Reports came in daily: more firebombing, more destruction. Entire neighborhoods flattened. The flames had reached not only Tokyo, but Nagoya, Osaka, and Yokohama. The B-29 seconds came in waves, now relentless, mechanical, immune to interception. Japan's air defenses had become little more than flak bursts against the sky. Inside a dimly lit office, stacks of unused Fugo components piled up like relics of a forgotten ambition. Paper envelopes, fuses, altitude sensors, all waiting for orders that no longer came. The project, once championed by Major General Tsuyoshi Kusaba with fanfare and secrecy, now sat quietly shelved. No announcement marked its end. No final balloon launched in tribute. Just silence. The last recorded launch occurred in late April 1945. After that, no more balloons took flight. Hydrogen reserves were nearly gone. The factories in Ojiya had been damaged in a recent bombing raid. Skilled workers had been conscripted or killed. The military itself had shifted focus from clever weapons of psychological warfare to preparing for the inevitable. A final defense of the Japanese homeland. Fugo had been an experiment, daring, creative. But in the face of overwhelming American industrial might, it had proven little more than a whisper against a hurricane. On the ground in Japan, the remains of the Fugo operation faded into obscurity. Production facilities were dismantled, repurposed, or destroyed. Drawings were burned, officers reassigned. And just like that, the world's first intercontinental weapon campaign ended without ceremony. In the months that followed, Japan faced starvation, military collapse, and the creeping realization that defeat was no longer a question of if, but when. The Fugo engineers, once proud of their intricate ballast systems and handmade paper envelopes, now worked in bomb shelters and supply depots, their innovations discarded as curiosities. By July, the name Fugo was rarely spoken aloud. Thousands of miles away, in the United States, the military knew the campaign had tapered off. Signal intelligence stations along the Pacific coast had intercepted fewer Japanese weather patterns. Sightings of balloons dropped to nearly zero. The Forest Service, while still alert, had scaled back emergency patrols. No new fires were reported from suspicious sources. And after the War Department's controlled release of information in May, public fear had subsided. The press moved on to other stories: the fall of Berlin, the brutal fighting on Okinawa, the ongoing question of how and when Japan would surrender. To the American public, the balloon bombs became a strange footnote in an overwhelming war. Something to shake one's head at, peculiar, almost laughable. A nation trying to set fire to forests with paper and wind. But to those who had studied the campaign closely, the men in Army ordnance, the intelligence officers who collected fragments, the foresters who found unexploded bombs among the trees, the weapon was not ridiculous. It had worked. Not often. Not strategically. But enough. It had made landfall. It had killed. And it had proven that the next war, if it ever came, would not respect oceans. At a remote Army depot in eastern Washington, crates labeled Fugo debris, classified, sat stacked in a cold warehouse. Inside them were pieces of silk and sandbags, bomb fuses, and partially intact envelopes. Some carried Japanese writing. Others bore fragments of Buddhist scripture prayers folded inside the very skin of the balloon, sent across the sky like offerings of flame. The items were studied, cataloged, filed. A few were quietly sent to scientific institutions for research. Most were simply stored and forgotten. Decades later, some would surface in museums. Others would remain buried in archives, unopened, their labels faded and peeling. In Oregon, the mountain didn't forget. Gearhart remained the same, windswept, forested, remote. But the people who lived in its shadow remembered. For a long time, the blast site was left untouched. Some avoided it out of grief, others out of superstition. Local boys whispered that it was haunted. Hikers occasionally found pieces of shrapnel, half buried in moss. Rangers were told never to disturb them. It wasn't until years later that a modest stone marker was placed at the site. No politics, no blame, just names. 6 lives, carved into granite beneath the pine trees. Most who passed it never knew what had really happened. Fewer still understood what had come across the ocean. The Japanese war machine would not survive the summer. In July, the Allies issued the Potsdam Declaration, demanding unconditional surrender. Japan refused. On August 6th, an American B-29 dropped a single bomb on Hiroshima. 3 days later, a second fell on Nagasaki. On August 15th, Japan surrendered. The war was over. And with its end, the story of Fugo drifted into the background. No trials were held for its engineers. No proclamations condemned it. Its legacy was neither victory nor failure, just a quiet footnote, written in jet stream winds and forest fires. But for one town in Oregon, it was no footnote. And for one man, who stood alone on that mountain, it would never be forgotten. The war ended, but for Archie Mitchell, time did not move forward in the same way it did for everyone else. While cities across America erupted in celebration, that August bells ringing, flags waving, men kissing strangers in the streets, he sat alone in the back pew of his small Oregon church, head bowed, the sound of fireworks echoing faintly through the valley. Victory meant nothing to him. His war had ended months earlier, in a clearing of burned soil beneath the pines. He stayed in Bly for several months after the funerals. The congregation urged him to take leave, to visit family, to start fresh. But Archie couldn't. Each sermon felt heavier, each Sunday quieter. The sound of children singing hymns brought back the laughter he could still hear in his dreams. Eventually, he left. He packed the house that had once been his home, sold the car, and walked away from the mountain that had taken everything. The Oregon winds carried him eastward toward new towns, new missions, but never away from what had happened. By 1946, Archie had joined a missionary training program in Chicago. He threw himself into his work with mechanical precision. No hesitation, no rest. His peers admired his discipline, his calm voice, his unshakable faith. None of them knew the full story. When they asked why he had joined, he simply said, "Because I still have a purpose." He remarried a few years later, a fellow missionary named Betty. She understood something about grief, about endurance. Together they volunteered for overseas service under the Christian and Missionary Alliance, bound for the Philippines. In 1949, Archie stepped off a transport ship into the humid air of Mindanao, the same ocean that once carried death toward him, now stretching endlessly behind. He had found a new calling: to build, to heal, to serve. The mission compound at Patakul was small, just a chapel, a clinic, a handful of houses, but it was alive with hope. Archie worked with local villagers, teaching, helping repair wells, and translating scripture into local dialects. The air smelled of salt and burning palm husks. At night, he often walked outside the compound and looked at the sky. The Pacific winds blew warm and constant. Somewhere, he thought, those winds had once carried the thing that shattered his life. And yet here he was still alive, still breathing under the same sky. The peace he found was fragile. In the early 1950 seconds, the region began to grow unstable. Communist guerrillas, the Hukbalahap movement, had begun targeting foreign missionaries. Raids on rural villages increased. The Philippine government warned Americans to relocate to safer zones. Archie refused. He had survived once before, he told his superiors. God would protect him again. By 1958, he and Betty had been stationed in Mindanao for nearly a decade. Their work was respected, their presence welcomed by many of the locals. But one August morning, as the mist hung low over the jungle, that fragile peace collapsed. Armed men descended on the mission compound. They were members of a guerrilla faction known for taking hostages for ransom and political leverage. Shots echoed through the trees. When it was over, 3 missionaries lay dead. Archie and several others were missing. Witnesses later said they were marched into the forest bound, barefoot, silent. The kidnappers disappeared into the mountains, and no one followed. For weeks, American and Filipino search teams combed the jungles, calling his name. They found traces, footprints, scraps of fabric, an old Bible with his initials carved faintly into the leather. But Archie himself was gone. Months turned into years. No ransom demand ever came, no message, no proof of life. Officially, he was declared dead in 1962. Unofficially, among those who had known him, the hope lingered far longer. Back in Oregon, the town of Bly never forgot. Every May, small groups gathered in the clearing at Gearhart Mountain, where a stone monument now stood beneath the tall pines. Moss grew thick around its base. The names carved there had softened with time, but each letter still caught the light when the sun passed through the canopy. Archie's name wasn't among them, though his absence was felt in every prayer spoken there. Visitors sometimes came from faraway historians, veterans, the curious. Some left flowers. Others left small paper cranes, folded by hand, their wings spread open to the wind. The forest, in its quiet way, had become a place of remembrance. And the balloon, the strange weapon that crossed the Pacific, had become more than an act of war. It was now a thread connecting two worlds, one of ambition and vengeance, and another of grief and endurance. Even decades later, hikers still found traces of it. Rusted fragments of the bomb casing, tangled bits of wiring. Once, in the 1970 seconds, a forestry crew unearthed an unexploded Fugo near the Umpqua National Forest, its fuse still intact after 30 years. The Army sent a demolition team. It was destroyed where it lay. History would eventually file the Fugo campaign under failure. Only a fraction reached their target. Only 6 lives were taken. But numbers never tell the weight of what they measure. For Archie, it had been the end of one life and the long, quiet test of another. For Japan, it was the last gasp of an empire trying to wound a giant across an ocean. For America, it was a reminder that distance was no longer safety. The wind, after all, carried more than weather. It carried memory. And even after the war, it never stopped blowing. Autumn winds stirred the leaves in the Cascade foothills as a group of hunters moved carefully through the forest north of Medford, Oregon. The year was 1978. The war had been over for more than 3 decades. Few remembered that anything once fell from the sky besides snow and rain. One of the hunters, an older man, paused when he spotted something half buried in the dirt under a tangle of roots. It looked like a rusted tank or perhaps part of an old stove, but the shape was wrong. Too symmetrical. Strange protrusions jutted from the base, and thick black wire coiled like dormant snakes around its edges. They reported it. By nightfall, the site was cordoned off by military trucks. A bomb disposal team from the Army arrived at dawn. What they found was a nearly intact Fugo device, its ballast mechanism partially rusted, but its 15-kilogram incendiary charge still live. More than 30 years later, it had remained hidden in the forest. If a child had stumbled upon it, or a fire had sparked nearby, it could have detonated with the same force that had shattered Bly. This wasn't the first, and it wouldn't be the last. Through the 1,980 seconds and 90 seconds, balloon bomb discoveries trickled in across the Pacific Northwest. In Idaho, a rancher unearthing a new irrigation trench struck metal and called the sheriff. In Alaska, hikers spotted a collapsed envelope frozen under layers of permafrost. In Montana, a hunter retrieved a tattered paper panel with Japanese script and turned it over to a local museum. By the early 2000s, over 300 Fugo-related incidents had been documented across the US, Canada, and Mexico. Not all involved explosives. Many were just fragments, silk panels, spent ballast rings, partially melted valves. Some were found by accident, others through dedicated search. One historian, Dr. Ross Cohen of the University of Washington, spent years piecing together the Fugo campaign's full scope. He combed through declassified War Department records, obscure Japanese technical manuals, and scattered military field reports. In doing so, he uncovered the scale of what had once been thought a minor footnote. Over 9,300 balloons launched, with carefully engineered components, each representing the work of hundreds of laborers and engineers. And many of them, it turned out, were still out there. The remains of the campaign had long since passed from military concern to archaeological curiosity, but that didn't mean they were harmless. In 2014, a group of forestry workers near Lumbee, British Columbia, came across what looked like a cluster of old aircraft parts while clearing brush. The metal was fused with wire, and a small white disc jutted from the top. One of the workers had served in the Canadian Armed Forces. He recognized it instantly. Bomb squad units responded. The area was evacuated. The device was safely detonated on site. It had been sitting quietly in the forest for nearly 70 years. Museums began collecting the artifacts, finally able to display them after decades of secrecy and Cold War caution. The Smithsonian Air and Space Museum acquired several Fugo components in the early 2000s, placing them behind glass with sparse but sobering descriptions. Japanese fire balloon, Type B, circa 1944-45. Designed to ride the Pacific jet stream and ignite forest fires or strike civilian targets in North America. Visitors often paused in front of the exhibit, squinting at the fragile paper, the childlike simplicity of its shape. Most were stunned. Few had ever heard of it. For many Americans, the idea that a foreign weapon had successfully crossed the ocean and killed civilians on U.S. soil remained unbelievable. And yet it had happened. At Gerhardt Mountain, the stone memorial still stands. Time and weather have worn the edges, but the names remain legible. In recent years, historical societies have added a bronze plaque nearby, explaining the context of the tragedy in both English and Japanese. Every May, a small crowd gathers in silence. Veterans come. Locals come. Occasionally, Japanese visitors attend students, teachers, or tourists who had read of the incident and traveled across the world to stand at the place where it happened. There is no protest, no anger, only solemn remembrance. Sometimes, small paper cranes are left at the base of the marker. Their wings catch in the mountain wind, the same wind that once carried the balloon. For modern scholars of warfare, Fugo represents something unusual, a harbinger of future conflict, not in scale but in concept. A weapon launched across continents with no pilot, no steering, no command. Just release and let the world carry it. A crude ancestor of unmanned drones and long-range missiles. But where modern systems use satellites and precision guidance, the balloon bombs use something ancient, air and patience. And because of that, they still wait in silence, buried beneath forests, forgotten in snowfields, and tangled in the roots of old trees. The war ended long ago, but its artifacts remain scattered across landscapes that never expected to become battlegrounds. One of the last documented discoveries came in 2019, in the mountains of British Columbia. A hiker, taking shelter during a storm, noticed odd pieces of wire woven through the rocks. She marked the location. The authorities returned with specialists. It was a complete balloon assembly, its payload inert, its envelope shredded, but it had arrived, carried across the ocean, guided only by wind, drifting over clouds and cities in silence. A weapon forgotten, a history unearthed. On the ridge where the explosion happened, time moves differently. The forest has grown thick again. Sunlight filters through the pine canopy and dances across the moss-covered stones. Wildflowers bloom in the spring. Deer pass quietly in the early morning. No sign remains of what tore the silence apart, unless you know where to look. And if you do, if you step carefully up the trail and find the modest granite marker tucked near the trees, you'll find 6 names etched into its surface. Beneath them, a date, the 5th of May, 1945. And below that, a single line. The only known place on the continental United States where death resulted from enemy action during World War II. It's a simple memorial, unadorned, no fanfare, just stone, weather, and memory. And wind, always the wind. The balloon that killed them traveled over 5,000 miles without a pilot, without a radio signal, without guidance. It floated on atmospheric currents from the Japanese coast to the Oregon wilderness, silent, aimless, ghost-like. The same air that carried scents of spring through pine forests had carried death. And no one saw it coming. That's what makes the story endure. Not the scale of it, but the silence. The Fugo campaign did not flatten cities or sink fleets. It did not change the tide of war or destroy infrastructure. But in one small moment, in one forgotten corner of America, it shattered lives. And for decades, the silence around it made the tragedy even heavier, because it wasn't just the explosion that left a crater. It was the void that followed. For years, the families carried the weight alone. The parents who buried their children without answers. The husband who lost his wife and unborn child and was told to say nothing. The community that was asked to forget what it had seen. Even when the truth emerged slowly, incompletely, it came without recognition. No grand investigation, no medals, no apology, just a quiet confirmation that yes, this had happened. And no, there was nothing more to say. In a war filled with loud heroism and public sacrifice, the victims of the Fugo campaign were mourned in whispers. Their story became something passed down in families, shared between neighbors, and etched in the minds of those who lived in its shadow. And yet, the story did not disappear, because memory is stubborn. Because some things deserve to be remembered, even if they don't fit into textbooks or parade speeches. Because in an age of missiles and satellites, there is something haunting about a weapon so low-tech, so slow, so random, and so lethal. It's that contradiction that draws historians back to the story. A device made of rice paper and paste, launched by hand, guided by wind, that could drift silently into a country half a world away and kill a child on a picnic. War is often imagined as grand strategy, but it is also this: a single moment in a quiet forest, a wrong step towards something that should not have been there, a silence broken by fire. Today, school children in Bly still learn about what happened. Local volunteers keep the trail to the memorial clear. Visitors leave pine cones, flowers, sometimes folded notes. Occasionally, someone will bring a crane, delicate, white, its wings open to the breeze, and place it at the base of the marker. A gesture of sorrow, of remembrance, maybe even of forgiveness. The wind carries it for a moment before it settles. In Japan, the Fugo campaign is rarely mentioned. Most post-war generations have never heard of it. Even among historians, it is often overlooked an eccentric footnote in a war dominated by atomic fire and steel. But for those who worked on it, those who launched the balloons by hand under gray skies in the winter of 1944, it had meant something. It had been an act of resistance, of desperation, a way to strike back when there were no more ships, no more planes, no more hope. The paper used to build those balloons was folded in Buddhist temples. Some were inscribed with prayers, as if those who built them understood that what they were sending into the sky was more than a weapon. It was a message, however misguided, sent across an ocean. That message was received, not in words, in ash. Years pass, forests grow, generations forget. But stories, if told well enough, remain. They live in the wind, in the trees, in the space between what was and what should never have been. The balloon that killed those children could have landed anywhere. It could have landed in the ocean, on an empty field, in a canyon. It could have failed, deflated, vanished. But it didn't. It chose that spot, that moment, that group of lives. And the war, so often measured in millions, left its mark in 6. In the end, that's what makes the Fugo campaign matter. Not because it turned the tide of battle, not because it was technologically advanced, but because it reminds us how far grief can travel, how even a whisper from across the sea can become a roar in the wrong place, at the wrong time, and how war, no matter how distant, always finds its way home.